Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Canon 211. I'm your host, Jake Fowler. I'm here with the illustrious Fr Michael Rennier, priest of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, friend of mine, although I don't know he'd admit that in public. I just besmirched your reputation, Father.
It's too late now. It's in the public.
The cat's out of the bag. We're here in my home. We're drinking coffee. We're drinking boozy coffee. And we're going to be discussing localism, distributism, other isms like Catholicism maybe will come up.
We might come around to it.
Socialism might come up.
Right.
Capitalism might come up. Father, thanks again for making the journey down to the fortress. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm better now. We've got the kids are off swimming.
Right.
They went to a mutual friend of ours, and they're going to enjoy the day while we do this. Hopefully one take, but it could get a little hairy depending on the level of bourbon. Before we forget, I really should say something about your books.
That sounds great.
Or maybe you could say something
that sounds
about
great.
your books. I can talk about this one. This one's called The Forgotten Language. How recovering the poetics of the Mass will change our lives. Folks, Sophia Institute Press, 2 years old now?
I think that's about how old it is. Yeah, year and a half.
This is a remarkable book. It does not read like a theology book, but it is loaded with the beauty of Catholic theology. It's all about how Mass can transform you if you're able to slow down and let it do so. So I highly recommend that one. Again, Sophia Institute Press. But you, Father, why don't you tell us about this little gem?
All right, this one's just out. This one's also from Sophia Institute Press. I'll make sure they can see it. This one's called Localism, and this will form the subject matter
Indeed.
that we're going to be discussing today. So this has a number of contributors. Dale Ahlquist from the Chesterton Society is the one who put it all together, along with Michael Warren Davis at Sophia Institute Press. I'm in there. Senator Marco Rubio is in there, which is intriguing. Anthony Esselin has a chapter. Joseph Pierce has a chapter. I read the whole thing as soon as I got it. It was a quick read, really interesting. It was not over my head theologically. I'm not a great theologian. It's kind of you to point out that the Poetics of the Mass book doesn't have too much theology in it. That's because I went to a Protestant seminary, so I do the best I can. But it's very readable, practical advice on what it means to live by localist principles. Often we think these are out of our reach. I promise you they are not, and this we'll dig into today. But anyway, this is out.
Yeah, we're going to talk about
I'll be
that.
speaking on the panel on this book at the Chesterton conference in Philadelphia, which is I think in late July. But if you look that up,
is there time to register?
There is, absolutely. Yeah, I believe it's July 25th is the first day, 25th through 27th. But
so we will put the links to these books and to the conference in the description below this video. Yeah. And without further ado, let's jump right in. So when we talk about localism, when we talk about distributism and these other isms that I mentioned a moment ago, the church has a position on these kind of things, but it's sort of hard to pin down. So maybe you could start by offering quick definitions, like when you say localism, what do you mean, so that we can be specific. And then what does the church have to say about the economic question in general?
Sure. So localism is a new term that the Chesterton Society is attempting to popularize. Essentially, it's equivalent to distributism.
Okay.
And the reason they're trying to popularize the different word is because, among other things, it seems more accurate about what we're doing, more practical. What does it mean to live locally with the Catholic principle of subsidiarity? What can I do for myself in my neighborhood with my family to make my corner of the world a more beautiful, better place? That's really the question, and it's a very practical question. The reason for the rebrand is because if you hear the word distributism, well, what is it? It's some high-flown, abstract economic theory. It sounds vaguely socialist. Right? Does it mean that the church is going to take our property and redistribute it to everyone else against our will? And I can tell you my experience with distributism is I came in contact with the word maybe 20 years ago when I was still a Protestant, and I was reading Chesterton. I loved Chesterton at the time, and he talks a lot about distributism. but it was one of the few things that he wrote about that never quite clicked with me. And I think it was because of how off-putting the word is.
Sure.
And because it can be intimidating. I'm not an economist. I don't understand capital markets and how you invest and how you do this and that and how governments ought to arrange themselves. Luckily, the Catholic Church doesn't care about those things either. The Catholic Church is very practical, and she's interested in economics, but more so the moral principles that underlay economic theories. So localism or distributism doesn't seem to propose any specific form of government that we have to adhere to, or any school of economics that we have to adhere to. But more it's a practical consideration of what does it mean to live a just life, to give people what they're due so that they don't become wage slaves,
Sure.
captive to economic principles against their will. But how do we increase ownership in this life that we've been given so that we all can own, we all can be creative, and we can all produce good things that we're happy with?
So how does this play itself out in the context of America in 2024? Because you mentioned just now, we don't want to be a wage slave. Well, I can't just go to my employer and dictate how much I ought to be paid. I mean, maybe some of you can. I really can't do that. I have to say, here's what I think is fair. Here's what I can do. Here's what I promise the result you'll get. What do you say, boss? And kind of put it on their end, and they come back with, well, we think you can make this much. Does that work for you? There may be a little wiggle room for negotiating, but I think for the most part, people just, here's your hourly rate. Here are your expected duties. Take it or leave it. So what is different in the localist mindset than what we've got now, which is obviously much more free market? Does that make sense?
Sure. So the church begins to address this in Rerum, Novarum, which I printed out for us so we can reference it if we need to, which is a papal encyclical by Leo XIII, and it was published in 1891.
That's right.
Okay, which is the height of the Victorian era, the industrialization of the West. And at that time, this term wage slave was very, very applicable because people are being gathered into factories and these collectivized capital markets, and they're being underpaid, they're being overworked, they're miserable, their lives are not going well, slums are developing, it's dirty, their houses are dirty, there's pollution.
You think of like London the way Dickens described
exactly. it. So the worst of like the Dickensian, right, his descriptions of how miserable it can be. Orphans, right, because their mother and their father work in dangerous factory jobs and have died, or practically speaking, they're orphans because their father works 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, and these children are miserable. They're disconnected from their families, and this is what Leo XIII is seeing, and he's responding to when he writes Rerum Novarum, because we conflate capitalism as a theory with free markets.
I did that faux pas a moment ago, didn't I?
I don't know. If you did, I didn't catch you. They're not the same thing.
Okay.
Right. So capitalism is an economic theory by which capital is turned to efficient use by being collected. In the American context, by globalist corporations. There can be benefits to that efficiency.
Sure.
Right. So Walmart clearly is efficient and delivers cheap, abundant goods to us at a low price. That is what Walmart has done, at least historically. And you can look at that and say, this is the good. Through the collectivization of capital, we can have cheaper, more abundant material goods. It's efficient. The Catholic Church, though, would say, well, is that the highest good?
Well, no, I mean,
it's not. It's not, right? So the highest good is the common good of people. It's a living wage. It's a happy life. It's ownership. Which isn't to say Walmart is bad or evil, or that the capitalist markets have not brought any good to the world. But it simply means it's probably not the ideal way to arrange our free market system. So because it's a collectivization, and the church is always against collectivization, whether it be the socialist collectivization of our goods via the government, taking our goods and redistributing them as the government sees fit, or collectivization via globalist corporations. Right? So distributism or localism is somewhere in between there, promoting localist principles of widely held ownership, creativity, spread out across free markets. It might look something like the homeschool mother who made this cassock for me, who lives in town here. So she learned how to make it. She made it for me. I didn't have to go to a large clergy company, right? She worked for herself. She made her own money. She has ownership of the process. And I vastly preferred that. Or the coffee we're drinking that I took and I imported and I roasted. Oh, there we go. Brewery brand coffee, right? Which is available at the Oratory of Saints Gregory and Augustine.
I don't know if you all caught that. Father Rennier roasted this coffee, like in my cup right now.
Correct, right.
It's delicious, by the way.
So we have a company called Starbucks, you may have heard of it, that exists in the United States.
Familiar.
They make a really atrocious product. It's terrible. It's burned. Because they are collectivizing the wealth, they're trying to get a standard, efficient cup of coffee into the hands of people who want it fast in the morning. They jam it full of 1,000 calories because that's how you make it taste good. But you're not getting the best out of the coffee. Right? You're getting something efficient, but not something good, and not something healthy. And that's the difference, right? So we're talking about localist things. This cassock, I think, is better than anything a large company could have made. This coffee, I dare say, is competitive with any coffee you can find that's out there. And it's because we've taken ownership of these products. And there's great joy in creating these products.
You know, so an objection then that comes to mind is that often, like the small business or the mom and pop shop, for example, the lady that made your cassock, she probably has to charge more. And this coffee, I know it costs a little bit more. And when you purchase from a business or an individual where they're not reaping the benefits of economies of scale, in other words, efficiency, it seems like you actually end up taking a loss, like compared to your neighbors or something, right? My neighbor over there, you can probably see out the window, he's got a boat. There's no way I'll ever be able to afford a boat. But if I could, I would have to buy a boat from a company that makes 10,000 boats a year versus from somebody who just makes the one, because the guy who just makes one boat and sells one boat probably needs to charge so much more. So I think this is an objection.
Sure.
Now, we talked about this on Sunday after Mass. How do you encounter that objection? Like if somebody says, well, that's great, Father, but localism isn't going to work. I don't have the money for that.
Sure. I think there's probably, and keep me on track here, I think there's probably 3 responses to that.
Okay.
So the first would be...
notes. There will be a quiz later.
Sure. So the first would be that there's not anything objectionable about labor coming together collectively to produce products efficiently. The objection would be the collectivization of the capital required and then turning those employees into wage slaves. So what this might look like in the American context is worker-owned cooperatives, unions, guilds. Even if you have an owner who is in charge, he's your CEO, but he invests his employees with some ownership of common stock in the company, or a profit-sharing scheme where they have ownership in the quality of the product, and they thrive as the quality of the product goes up and they're able to sell more of it.
Like an electric co-op? Like electric companies. When I lived in Columbia, Missouri, it was Boone County Electric Cooperative.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it, but sure. There certainly are examples of this that work.
Credit unions.
Right.
Okay. All right. Very good.
Right. So giving the employees some ownership in the product, and then you can still have an economy of scale where you get your boat for the right cost, and you're not buying a boutique ad hoc product that costs twice as much.
Okay.
So that would be one thing. Let me see what my other things were. I should have written them down before I started.
On Sunday
talking.
after Mass.
So the second thing. Yes, sometimes it looks like you're paying more. So if you go to a farmer's market as opposed to the local grocery store, you are going to pay more. And sometimes people feel guilty when they hear how into localism I am, and they say, Father, I just can't afford to do what you want to do. I have 6 kids. I have 8 kids. I have 9 kids. I cannot buy all my things at the farmer's market. I have to go to the big box store sometimes and just buy all of the cheap yogurt that they have.
Sure.
And all the cheap eggs that they have, because this is how we stay alive. And I think that's a reasonable objection. We want to have a thriving family, but we don't want to allow economics to limit us. I think it's better to have a lot of kids and go to the big box store and feed them,
yes,
rather than limit the number of kids you have so you can go to the farmer's market. And I think that's a trade-off that's worth making.
Well, if anyone has not encountered Father Rennier before, he's one of these rare birds who, well, you mentioned you grew up Protestant, went to Protestant seminary.
Right.
But you didn't mention this time, on another video you did, but this time we failed to mention that you were a convert from Anglicanism, which allows for married clergy. You are married. You have a gaggle of children. So between the two of us, we have like 15 children. So these aren't pie-in-the-sky ideals where Father says, oh, of course, have a large family, but he doesn't have one. No. You do have a large family, and yet you're living by these localist principles. So you're living proof that it actually does work.
Right.
In your book chapter, which you were so kind to send me, you mentioned that you have hardly anything in your home that has been mass-produced.
Correct.
And that struck me as, first of all, an indictment against me, because, I mean, look around. All this stuff has been mass-produced in one way or another. But I thought, oh my goodness, he must be living like that virtue of evangelical poverty, which doesn't mean destitution, but it does mean a really firm understanding and a distinction between wants and needs. So maybe, can you shift it a little bit and talk about how the virtue of thrift,
sure,
comes into play here?
Which would be my third point.
Yeah, so
yes.
I think, like that's pretty key. If you want to buy the eggs that are $9.50 a dozen, what do you do?
Right. Let me wrap up.
Okay.
Point 2, if you don't mind.
Please.
Right. So often you're paying more, and that's a luxury. So we make our choices. What's worth paying more for? What isn't? And sometimes, yes, it's a loss. But out of principle, I buy this coffee as opposed to going to the Starbucks because I want to support local. And I can do it this week. I have the cash this week that I can support the things that are important to me. And I do think that's worth all of us thinking about, because this is a moral question about justice.
Indeed.
It's not simply an aesthetic concern. Although, as we continue talking, you will see that aesthetic concerns are of primary importance to me.
Well, so
but it is a virtue we're talking about when
Yes.
when we're talking about support local. So 2 of my daughters have dresses that your wife made, right?
That's right.
A
Yes.
local shop. I'm not going to lie, her dresses are more expensive.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
They are absolutely more expensive. But here's how I would begin to, I think, talk through that second objection, I think, more completely, which is that those dresses cost more, but they look better. They're beautiful. And they are going to last longer.
They are intended to last
Exactly.
through several children.
They're made by a seamstress who loves to make dresses, who takes pride in her work, who understands what children will put a dress through. She's making it with high quality. It's not just simply something to be made as cheaply as possible. Her fabrics are beautiful. So if you do the math, I suspect often these things that seem to be more expensive are not more expensive. And that might be a difficult argument. There's going to be a high time preference to prove those arguments out. We might have to wait 10 years to see how your wife's dress ages and how long it lasts. But I know for a fact that there are certain things in my life I bought that were more expensive but were higher quality that have absolutely lasted.
Well, it's that
longer.
saying, you get what you pay for.
I think so.
So if you pay $3 for a T-shirt for one of your sons, and it gets snagged on a tree branch and the sleeve rips off. Like, yeah, that's what you paid for. You paid $3 for a t-shirt versus if you get one that's maybe constructed a little sturdier, then it should presumably last a little longer.
Right.
Now,
right.
So coming back to thrift then for
Okay.
your third point.
Sure.
I think it's very difficult for Americans, and I, of course, am including myself in this scathing indictment, to realize that no, you don't actually need all this stuff, and it might look cool, and you get a great deal on Amazon.com, but it's taking something away. So you're spending a little bit, right? You get goods cheaply, but you're nickel and diming yourself into a materialist, consumerist mindset that I think militates precisely against what you're saying is the ideal. The local, the small business, the not exactly boutique or gourmet, but approaching that, right? Which you necessarily have to consume less of, right? You don't necessarily buy brand new designer clothing. You don't buy brand new designer furniture. You don't buy these sort of things, right? And this seems to be this thrift, if I'm not mistaken, or am I mistaken? Correct me, please.
No, I think you're on the right track. Absolutely. So, in response to that consumerist mentality, which who of us, if you've thought deeply about your life, has not recognized and had an adverse reaction to? Particularly, let's say you're 20 years old, you're an earnest young person, you're in college, you're learning philosophy for the first time, you're diving in, and you suddenly realize, oh, I want nothing to do with this consumerist, throwaway, materialist culture that we live in. This is what happened to me.
Sure.
20-year-old young man, no prudence whatsoever, very rash. And so I went through my phases. I thought, I'm going to be a communist. I'm going to be a Marxist. I'm going to be a socialist. I'm going to reject Western culture. I'm going to be a Buddhist. And then finally settling into some sort of minimalist principles. I have to get rid of all my stuff and be a minimalist and sit in a one-room flat with one single book and own nothing, because that's how I can
Das Kapital.
That's how I can escape, right? Yeah, that's the one book, right?
Rolling your hand, rolling cigarettes.
No, the one book I would own is The Forgotten Language by Fr Michael Rennier. I just look at it and say, it's so good. It's so good, right? Yeah. So and I went through that phase where I thought, I can't own anything.
Sure.
I am a minimalist. And over the years, as I gained maturity, I realized this is not what God wants for us either. This is not just. Having nothing, disembodying or disincarnating our existence.
Okay.
That is not a Catholic outlook whatsoever. To think that we are here to escape from created things in order to have a more pure spiritual life or a more pure philosophical outlook.
Isn't that, would you say that that's one of the paradoxes of what some people would call the modern project, like the Enlightenment project, to rid us from the clutches of religion, to stop thinking in terms of incarnation and start thinking in terms of, on the one hand, materialism, in the sense that all that it really is material. But on the other hand, there's like a vague spiritualism or like a Gnosticism that accounts for our the aspects of human existence that aren't material. So you have these two, it's like the Enlightenment drove a wedge in the incarnation and separated back out the Son of God and the man, Jesus, right? Instead of holding them in tension. Right. So if you can't be a minimalist, but you don't want to be a consumerist, what do you do?
Right, so what we do is we seek beauty in all things. And one of the ways that we can do that within the context of this discussion of distributism and what we're buying, what we're consuming, what we surround ourselves with in our homes, is through that virtue of thrift. So Chesterton talks about the beauty of thrift. And this is what my chapter in Localism is actually honing in on, is the beauty of being thrifty. Because thrift doesn't simply mean not having things.
Okay.
It also doesn't mean obsessing over buying new things and consuming new things, and always getting the cup of coffee in the morning from the store, and always looking at what sale is happening at Amazon, and consuming and just having things. Both of those outlooks on life miss the point entirely. So the one abuses material things as if they're worth nothing, right? So let's just consume everything. It doesn't matter if it's low quality. I just want cheap thrills, surface level, cheap coffee, cheap clothing, whatever. And the other is, well, I don't want anything because material things are not worth my time, so I'm going to have nothing. But the Catholic outlook is that because our Lord is incarnate, because he takes on, because he assumes human flesh, he redeems human flesh. And he redeems via human flesh, right, all of creation. So creation is good. We're not meant to escape it. We're meant to redeem it. And that means that we are seeking beauty.
Okay.
Particularly beauty through joining God in his creative act.
So by becoming, as you mentioned at the outset, owners,
right,
producers,
right,
we more closely resemble God.
Exactly.
In virtue, like
exactly,
God the Father
because
and
we
the Son.
become creative.
Yes.
And so we are trying to create beauty in our little piece of the world and do what we can in our local environment. And this is the Catholic teaching of subsidiarity. Always do things at the lowest level possible.
Right.
So as a father, you start with your family. You start with your marriage, with your children, your own home. Run it in as beautiful a fashion as you can. Whether that means putting up your kids' art on the walls because they're creating, teaching your children how to dress well, right? Making dresses, having little home businesses.
Sure.
The kids can participate in these things, making rosaries, making devotional items, taking your children to Mass and helping them to participate in the Holy Sacrifice in whatever way is appropriate to them. So if you have your boys, bring them into the altar serving crew and teach them how to do that. It's making beauty in your house, planting flowers, painting, being involved in the arts, chopping wood in the backyard, starting a podcast.
Yeah, well.
It's all of these things, whatever it is,
Sure.
right? And it's going to be different. The outcomes are going to be different. They have to be different. This is what Leo XIII says in Rerum Novarum. You have a gift and I have a gift, and they're different gifts, and there's beauty in the diversity. So your version of localism is different than my version of localism, by definition.
Okay, so this is really good. This is like, this ties into so many areas of theology, which we're not going to suddenly go into all that. But I'm thinking like concentric levels of communion with the Church of Christ.
Right.
Like at the broadest level, we're in communion with the universal church, including the communion of saints in heaven, the suffering souls in purgatory. And then you can take it in a level and say, well, we're in the Latin rite. So we're in communion in a closer way with all those who share our Latin Roman patrimony. And then you can bring it in another level. Well, we're American. And there's a certain expression to Catholicism that's come about in America. And then you can go in a little further. We're Midwestern, right? There's a Midwestern culture. And Missouri is part of the Midwest, Flanders. I don't care what you say.
What does he say?
He says it's the South. I said there's no
I think
way.
St. Louis is Southern.
Well, St. Louis has a
I'm
Southern
with, what's
flair.
his name?
But
Flanders?
Flanders.
I'm with you, Flanders. It's a southern city.
We might have to cut.
That's
I
all
don't know about this. I have heard St. Louis actually referred to as the northernmost southern city. Yeah. So, all right, be that as it may, the church in St. Louis has its own culture and our oratory, again. And then, so it seems like this diversity, like the multiplicity of voices at the universal level, and as you narrow it down, when you get to the smallest unit, you realize that there's an immense amount of diversity there too.
Right.
So we're avoiding that homogeneity that the economies of scale, like a Walmart. If Walmart ran a church, it would all be the same everywhere you went. Every building would look the same. Every liturgy would be done exactly the same. The homilies would all be the same because they're mass produced. And they would lack this virtue of thrift.
Right.
They would lack this beauty. They would lack handmade, homemade cassocks and altar vestments and things like that. So
Right, they're meant. These parishes are meant to be different.
yes.
So we go very, very wrong when we try to impose large-scale solutions to evangelization or the way the Catholic school system runs in a diocese. The schools, the parishes should look different from parish to parish because they have local gifts. One of the things that annoys me to no end, one of my pet peeves, you go in certain Catholic churches and you can go all over the world and you see the banners.
Oh yes, the
They're
banners.
the same banners. The same banners here, there, everywhere. Same large company has made these banners, I guess.
Of course.
And I think that's such a shame because
Well,
I know there's talent in this place.
We need to be hip, though. We need to be like...
But we can be more hip
Coming
by
at you.
making our own banners, right? Make our own thing. So our oratory just made a beautiful banner of Our Lady of Walsingham. The Girls Guild made it.
Is that right?
Yeah, they
Is that the one they processed with?
they carried it for the May crowning. They made
May-
that banner themselves.
Not the Corpus Christi procession?
Not that one.
Different. Okay, different band.
But they made it. They painted it. They designed it. They painted it.
Wow.
They sewed it. They put it all together. It was an entirely local project. And when I put it on my Facebook page, I immediately got comments from people saying, "Where'd you get it? How do I buy it? How do I get one of these?
Like,
it's amazing."
It's not
And
how
I
that
said,
works.
"Well, maybe the Girls Guild will open up a shop. But for now, it's not available anywhere because we made it for our community.
Sure.
And it would be a great thing if the girls at the church next door made something like that for their community."
Right.
We have vestments. I wear vestments that were made just for me by small seamstress shops. They are not from large companies, and because of that, they're unique. They're diverse from all the vestments. They're easily recognizable. This is a Catholic priest vestment. It's chasuble, etc. But they are designed in collaboration with another person, my seamstress, and we put it together, and we have a beautiful handmade, locally made product, and it looks different than what the priest next door is wearing, and that's great.
Even
there's-
different from what Monsignor's wearing, to some extent.
Yeah, he doesn't let me wear his vestments yet. But
I'll
he's
talk.
very generous.
I'll talk to him.
So yeah, we have different things, and there's beauty in that diversity, and that is thrift,
Yes.
right? We're not just going out and splurging on a bunch of mass-produced banners because that's what everyone else is doing, and just give money away, and then we get a
Right.
product that
So-
we have no connection with.
So thrift isn't, let me see what I can get at the lowest price, because that actually plugs you back into the consumerism that you're trying to avoid.
I think so, but it is important because we are Americans. So we are inescapably in a society where, as you
Yes.
mentioned earlier, you do have to buy things at stores. You do have to go to a job, and there's few of us that have ownership of our own careers. But most of us go off and receive a paycheck. So we do have to work within this system.
Well, let's, not to interrupt, but let's go in that direction.
Sure.
So if we're going to shift, let's suppose the trash candidates that are currently running for president were not running for president.
Okay.
And we had somebody, just one candidate, maybe like a king, for example,
Okay.
who wanted to implement localism on a national scale.
Mm-hmm.
How would that work? Like, how is that not just going to be socialism? Because obviously it wouldn't necessarily be government run if you're truly localist.
Right.
But what sort of shifts in people's behavior, their mindset? What has to happen? So if somebody is watching this or listening and thinks this is really appealing, how do I do it? What needs to happen?
Sure. So that's two questions. So on the large scale, the government question, for that to work, the federal government, this alleged candidate of yours, this theoretical candidate, would have to immediately give away almost all of his power once he achieves office.
Okay.
Because the principle, the founding federation, right, of this experiment is that the federal government defers in almost everything to the states, right? So that's already a localist
10th
principle.
Amendment.
Right, the founding of America is localist, but over time we've had creep in the federalist, right? So the national branch.
And
of
it just
the
goes
government.
one way.
And it
As
only
we
goes
see.
one way.
Yeah.
But you do see occasionally states taking a little bit of control. The states do look different from each other. their local laws, their cultures, and etc. And that is the localist principle at work. So we would be looking from that perspective of how do we reform government to begin shifting things down the chain in terms of subsidiarity. So does the national government need to be doing this? No, we'll have the state government do it. Does the state government need to be doing this? No, we'll have the city council do it. Does the city council need to be doing this? We'll let the families do it. So the principle is always that the family is primary and the government serves the family.
Okay.
And then on a wider scale, the government needs to seek the common good.
And that isn't the aggregate of individual goods. At least that's not what the popes have said.
I think that's right.
In
I
fact,
think that's right. Yeah.
So John Paul II, in his 100-year commemoration of Rerum Novarum, specifically says, I don't know if he uses the exact words, but he goes out of his way to identify the common good, not simply the sum of everyone's individual goods, because then that lands you right back again in the sort of cutthroat consumerist mentality where all I have to worry about is maximizing my utility. And that guy over there will maximize his, and you will maximize yours, and we add these up, and whatever is the highest amount we could possibly achieve, that's the common good. John Paul II says, no. The common good is something that transcends mathematics, right? Which isn't just based on favorable economic outcomes, but corresponds to what's actually good for you as a human being.
Right.
This is where aesthetic might come in.
Absolutely, right? So if you're living this way, you're going to have a greater amount of happiness.
Yes.
Not necessarily more wealth or more efficiency or a bigger economy, but you will be happier. The people will be happier. Why? Because we are able to do what we are created to do. A father can be a father. A family can be a family. A parish can be a parish. The city government can focus on running the city for their citizens, for their needs. And we're not getting into these high-flown abstract theories. So the thing about localist principles and poetic principles, which is these aesthetic considerations where I think I'm on firmer footing,
Sure.
is that you're going into something that's a little bit harder to define, something nebulous. So what is happiness? What is the good, right? What is a good song? These things are difficult. What is a good poem, or what makes something poetic? There are ways to talk about it, but ultimately it's a knowledge that, because it's connected with the transcendent, we cannot define. But it's more concrete. It's less abstract and more concrete. So as a father, you are in this place, right? Your house, your family, your children. They're not replaceable with other children, right? It matters to you which 8 kids you have, right? We can't just swap them out. Sure. And you say, oh, that's fine, I'm still a father. Still have 8, whatever. You have 8, right? 9?
Going on 9.
I don't even know. Okay.
Well, 10 if you count the one upstairs.
Okay.
So
congrats on going on 9.
Going on
10.
Going on 9 living.
Yeah.
We suffered a miscarriage a couple years ago.
Right.
So yeah, this will be.
So it matters to you,
yes.
though, right? These kids, they have names, they are known, they are loved.
Yes.
It sounds obvious to say this, but
it's taken for granted. No, you're right. It's not obvious.
Right. We overlook it in so many other areas. It
Yes.
matters that we are in St. Louis, that we are parishioners at the Oratory. It's a theology of place. And it matters that we are in this place, and we shape the place, and we are shaped by the place. We shape our families, we're shaped by our families.
This theology of place is the second time today I've encountered this. The first time was when somebody promoted this recording. One of our executive producer here at Paleocrat Diaries, a man by the name of Jeremiah Bannister. He says he was shocked when he saw that I was interviewing you today. He didn't realize we knew each other. Mm-hmm. He never heard of you, and he said, "Oh my goodness!" He starts looking you up, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, Fr Rennier. He's written on distributism, and he's written on the beauty of the Mass, and he's got all like a bank of articles at aletheia.org, something."
Yeah.
And he was going to dive into your theology of place. Mm-hmm. I have not read this.
I think I wrote an article recently about St. Augustine of Canterbury and theology of place.
So what's up with that?
It's really the Benedictine principle, which is the Catholic principle.
Sure.
That you make your home in a place, And it is our stewardship as Christians to love that place and to bring God's beauty to it, almost turn it into our little corner of paradise. So it would be a shame if it's the principle of scouting, right? Leave the place better. If we lived in a place, if we trashed it, if we left it run down, and then we went off to our eternal reward and said, well, that place didn't matter. The place does matter because we are rooted here, and our home here is a reflection of our eternal home. It can't be the whole of it, and this is the poetic principle.
Sure. In
a poem, an apple's not just an apple, right? It's just a symbol of sin. A rose isn't just a rose, it's love. A falling leaf isn't just a falling leaf, it's mortality. But the poet is writing about that falling leaf that he saw on that afternoon, and he was in this mood, and this is how the light looked. It's concrete, and yet it opens up. It's a body that speaks to another body. They're almost like overlapping sensible bodies. But we have to have these things as human beings because the knowledge is not replaceable through abstract principles.
So a place where an individual's life, their unrepeatable life, occurs. In a poem, let's say, place would be everything about that person. Where you were born, where you're raised, how you're raised. When you come to maturity, it really shapes you in a way. So if you took the Michael Rennier out of St. Charles or out of New Haven, he's not the same.
Right.
And if you took me out of Joliet, Illinois, and Columbia, Missouri, and St. Louis, I'm not the same. So it strikes me as very biblical on the one hand, because Christ was incarnate in a certain place, and he's the only one of us who chose his place of birth, right? He grows up in a culture that has a very particular flavor. And he ministers to people who themselves are highly concrete, individual, and yet he's for all of us. So there's a concreteness, there's a particularity, and there's a transcendence. And this is kind of what I was saying before about the levels of communion in the church, like from the broadest scale down to the most local. These overlapping and sort of interlocking levels. I don't want to call our ecclesial communion like subsidiarity, but in a sense, what you can do for me on a weekly basis on Sunday, the communion of saints can't do for me. Right? You can say Mass in a place that I can be at, in a church beautified by our community. I can't just sit at home. I mean, we're not Protestants. We're not sedevacantists who sit at home and pray real hard. You have to be tied to a place because that's humanity.
Absolutely.
So then beautifying it, making it your own,
right.
Making it not different from others because you don't like what the others are up to. Like we love what they're doing down at Little Flower or at the other oratory. But it's not our place, right? And I love what you're doing at your home, but that's not my home. So this dynamic of the particular in the midst of the universal, I love this. It's a paradox,
that's the poetic paradox, right?
It's
so you love this thing,
yes,
and somehow in loving this thing, you are given everything else.
That's amazing,
right? And that is what the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass is. I won't divert us on this, but if you're interested in that question, that's what I talk about in my book. It has to be me at that Mass. I can't abstractly participate in it or intellectually participate in it. I have to be there in my body, smelling the incense, praying the prayers, being bored, being hot, feeling my knees hurt on the kneeler, being elated at times or wondering when the homily is going to be over at other times. But that, it has to be that.
Yes.
Because it's a poetic experience, the particular person, the concrete experience that then draws us into the universal body of Christ. And they go together and they're interlinked and they cannot be separated.
That's beautiful.
But that's why the localist principle is the way it is. It's concrete.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we've got, I want to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
We've got maybe 15 to 20 minutes left. Let's hit some of the other things we talked about. For one, I would like to know, how does localism or distributism distinguish itself from some forms of capitalism or socialism, right? Beyond the obvious, like there's something about localism that can't simply be replicated apart from the faith.
I think that's right. And Leo the 13th says this. He says, if you want to make these, if these principles are going to flourish, there has to be a Catholic culture underlying them. Because otherwise we get caught up in our vices, greed particularly, right?
Sure. Yes.
So,
well, let me ask a more specific question.
Yeah.
It's kind of going back to what we were saying before about my fictional monarch candidate for president. How does this localist project differ from some of the socialist revolutions?
Sure.
Like, are we just supposed to overthrow corporations as much as we can and live, establish a Catholic commune, something like that?
Not the first, obviously, because that would be a collective, an act of collectivization, right? Which is opposed to localism. Establishing a Catholic commune, that might be a great idea. But I would be careful about the principles by which the commune governed itself. It's almost more, hey, let's go live by a monastery and be happy together and do some local projects together and have a community that has stability. That, I think, is a wonderful, wonderful idea to have that subsidiarity in that sense that this is going to be our place and we are going to be here together. And there's going to be friction. Right, we like each other, but just wait until my cow wanders into your field and I break your fence going to get the cow. Right, and there's going to be friction, but we're there together. And I think that's the principle, right? Which is we're seeking virtue. We're seeking how to love God by loving our neighbor, by having an economic system or just simply a practical way of living our lives that encourages virtue. So it's a system that's not based on making money or redistributing wealth or eating the rich or any of these things. It's simply how can we seek the common good and the virtues of justice and beauty and love in our homes and in our communities. Another principle that's pretty important that Leo the 13th hammers on again and again in Rerum Novarum is that part of that principle of justice is private property. So if we go back to Christendom, right, the high medieval ages when these principles of localism were, I think, most widely practiced, what you see is, okay, you have a lower class and they have less wealth. But what did they have? They had a guaranteed right to private property. Their capitalist landlord could not bankrupt them and take their property because they had a right to earn a living. So you could be the worst farmer ever on your 5 acres, but you cannot be foreclosed on. And that's very, very important, that right to make a living. Or you would have a place in a guild that is a productive membership in a society, and you would pass that on to your children. They would have membership in the guild, and that was their right to a productive living. So you have these classes, the hierarchies, which is well and good. There's nothing wrong with that. You have nobility and serfs and you have the king, but they all work in harmony with each other. They're not opposed to each other, and they're not trying to make a buck off each other.
Sure.
So you don't have the workers revolting against the owner and stealing all of his property, and you don't have the owner who is impoverishing his workers and paying them a terrible wage. But what you have is something very, very close to harmony among the classes.
So there's a hierarchy.
Yeah.
A social hierarchy, we could call it.
Sure.
And it isn't simply based on money. In fact,
it's based on responsibility.
Sure.
So this is what we often, I think, mischaracterize about that kind of a society or the Catholic Church today within the ecclesiastical hierarchy.
Sure.
Just because you're on top of the heap doesn't mean that you have no responsibility.
Right, you're not the overlord.
It's the opposite, actually. You have more responsibility.
Yes.
Because you have a fatherly concern for those who God has placed you in charge of.
So one of the things Leo the 13th says, it's in paragraph 17. I'll just read a little bit.
Sure.
And this militates against the socialist project. That I'm sure he had this in mind. Second or third sentence. There naturally exist among mankind manifold differences of the most important kind. People differ in capacity, skill, health, strength, and unequal fortune is a necessary result of unequal conditions. Such inequality is far from being disadvantageous. Mm-hmm. So he's saying, like, you need to stop seeking this utopian equality that was the brainchild, for lack of a better term, of Marx and Engels and some of the other socialist thinkers, especially the French socialists.
He specifically teaches against Marx in paragraph 19 when he says, the notion that class is naturally hostile to class, and that the wealthy and the working men are intended by nature to live in mutual conflict, he says is so irrational and so false, right? So he's really not pulling any punches on this. And then he goes on to teach that the ideal is cooperation amongst the classes.
So it seems like the distributist model, the localist model of economics, isn't actually an economic system, but it's something. It's deeper than that. It's sort of. I want to call it like a metaphysic, in a way. Like it's the principles that undergird humanity in our interactions with one another and how we raise our families. So if you're living in a thoroughly Catholic society, whether that society is shared by most of your neighbors or not, whether if it's in your home and if it's in your parish, it counts, right? And you're implementing some of the things that Leo talks about and the other things that you've written about in your book, and like Chesterton and Belloc and these sorts of characters, then it's not economics 101, where you look at graphs and charts and how do I maximize. No, that's, again, thinking along Enlightenment principles. That's thinking like maximizing utility, and that's thinking in a very consumerist mentality. The localist, the distributist position seems to me, hearing you speak, is actually one of human flourishing, and not one of a more efficient, more effective, more appealing economic system. It seems like if you reprioritize your economics to focus on what's truly human, then you will end up with something like this, and you'll avoid the extremes, the twin sisters, as it were, of capitalism or Marxism. Does it make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. It's and that's why I think we have such a hard time wrapping our minds around, well, what is distributism? What is localism? It admits a very little in terms of abstract theory.
Sure.
Because as we've discussed, it's concrete. Its goals are goodness and beauty, and because that is the path to happiness, not having the biggest McMansion and having the boat at the lake and those sort of things. We think that'll make us happy. It does not. Or having a big salary doesn't actually make you happy.
No.
It's nice to have a certain amount of money, right? So you don't have to worry about it. You can take care of your family. But making more money and more money and more money does not make us happy. What makes us happy is our local home, our family, our children, our friends, our parish, and the beauty that we bring to it. And so in that sense, it's a very practical, very commonsensical way of viewing the world. And when people ask me, well, how do I get involved in it? It's actually very easy, because that's all it is, right? Plant a garden in the backyard, get some sun on your skin, enjoy, right? Go to the local distillery with your friend and have a glass of gin, right? Roast your own coffee. Take some ownership of something local. Contribute to your parish in some way by bringing your gift to it. And as long as you're doing those things, you're working in the right direction.
So the spirit of moderation, the virtue of temperance. We mentioned almost an hour ago, learning the difference and maintaining a firm boundary between want and need. right, to sort of maintain, right? Again, you can look around my living room and you can see all manner of things that I don't need. And then you can see things that I actually do need. Like I need a place for my pregnant wife to sit.
Right.
So it's important to have a chair.
Right.
But it may not be important to have 10,000 Legos.
That's debatable, but I'm following.
Maybe the number's more like 50,000. Whatever it is, do you need yet another device?
I think that's important. Redefining, well, what do I need?
Yes.
Do I need that beautiful painting that cost a lot of money from my friend who's an artist? Well, maybe. Okay. I might. Right? Because we need beauty.
Yes.
This is something William Morris talks about. He's a Victorian designer who actually is a straight up socialist, but he had he was really onto the right sort of thing.
That's in your chapter?
I think I mentioned him. He and his friends, the Pre-Raphaelites, he hung out with the Pre-Raphaelites. They simply just decorated their local church because they thought this is how we can make the church beautiful. So they just went and started painting, and they had the skills to do these things.
Sure.
And he founded the William Morris Company because his opinion was that Victorian England, was his context, had made the lives of common people ugly. And those ugly lives were not deserved because everyone deserves beautiful things. And so he made it his mission to design beautiful things. He didn't quite make it. His company is very expensive still, but he did pay.
Well, it's still in existence.
It still exists.
So it's successful.
Makes beautiful
measure.
Things. Beautiful things.
All right.
But that was his idea. Was look, being successful isn't about having a mansion in the country, the English countryside, and having 20 hand-carved chairs. It means you have your place in the world, and you can have one beautiful chair in it. It doesn't have to be ornate. It can be simple, but beautiful, well-made, useful. And that was always his goal, was to give people useful, beautiful things. So to me, we have to redefine, well, what do I need and what do I want? Do I need all those books? Yes, I do. I need all of the books. Do I need the brand new car? No.
The used car will be just fine.
The used car is just fine.
Sure.
Right.
Okay.
So I don't know, and we might ask ourselves those questions and get different answers.
So
but again, that's okay.
Yeah, and that's really helpful that you corrected me on that, because what in keeping with enjoying the fruits of creation and being creators in our own sense, which means for most people we're not living like radically poor Franciscans or something, or the Carmelites who don't even wear shoes. Appreciating the material wealth that comes from thrift, that comes from creativity, actually enables us to flourish more as human beings than, let's say, minimalist Fr Rennier, before he was Fr Rennier in his 20s. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do I need this microphone? No, I suppose not. But with it, we can do things that are helpful, that are beautiful to some degree. If you like Art Deco, I guess. Not everyone does. Father, we should probably wrap up soon.
Okay. Sure.
What else, if we had to summarize, can you make an elevator pitch for localism, distributism, or any other ism, Catholicism? Why should people care? And just for the record, this is what I will put out as the preview to this video, so no pressure.
Oh, so I have to get it right. I have to get it right. We'll try to summarize. It's. I mean, we look around at our consumer society, and it's so vapid, and the pop culture is clearly degenerating, and people are unhappy. They're in debt. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to get out of debt. They're unhappy at their work. They don't like their house. They always want the next thing, thinking that'll make them happier, and then they get it, and they are not happier. So what is more needed in our time than a complete reevaluation of our priorities, and to stop living for the materialistic things that we think will make us happy, or participating in the collectivization of wealth, or trying to engage in class envy, that we think if we can just push this next thing through, then our lives will become beautiful. It's time to give all that up. Focus on our neighborhood, our local area, our families, our friends. And when you do that, I guarantee you, it's not the easiest way, but you will be happier, and your life will be more beautiful. And I think that's the point.
Beautiful families, beautiful churches.
Right.
It's a beautiful life.
Exactly.
Well, there we go. We're going to close. We've got the music playing. We still have some coffee, Father. I hope you don't have to dash off too soon. We can wrap this up. We can finish our coffee. This has been a real treat for me.
It's been fun.
Thanks again for making the journey down here. I live a bit of a distance away from the Oratory, but Father was good enough to hop in his used automobile and make the trip. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one more time these two books. Could you hold that?
Sure.
Localism, which is the newer one, available from Sophia Institute Press, and this is the slightly older one, The Forgotten Language, also Sophia Institute Press. I will put links in the description to this video. Please support Fr Rennier. Please, if you're in St. Louis, buy some Breviary coffee, drink it with bourbon cream. It's quite delicious.
Right.
Have you had any of it?
Oh, I'm going to add some.
You better have some.
Yeah.
Okay. As we normally do, I need to remind all of you that here at the Paleocrat Diaries, we want you to never give up, to keep on smiling. It's a memento mori. Cheers.